For this special episode of Scholar Talks on Constitution Day Live, the guiding question is, why is it important for Americans to have conversations about contested ideals? Our very special guest today, Andrew Lang, is a professor of history at Mississippi State University. His first book, In the Wake of War, Military Occupation, Emancipation, and Civil War America, won the Tom Watson Brown Book Award. His second, A Contest of Civilizations, Exposing the Crisis of American Exceptionalism in the Civil War Era, was a finalist for the prestigious Lincoln Prize. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to this very special episode of Scholar Talks on Constitution Day Live. Andy, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, Constitution Day Live is a great time to reflect on the themes that you've written about, on American ideals, about American exceptionalism, those common ideals we have as Americans. But it's also an important time maybe to reflect on those times where we've disagreed about them as well.
Indeed. The whole idea of American identity, American exceptionalism, one can argue, and I certainly do argue, are notions that are even older than the United States itself, dating in the deep colonial past and transcending all the way to the present.
Now, you discussed the contested idea of American exceptionalism in the Civil War era. Can you maybe briefly describe for us what you mean by American exceptionalism?
I know for me, and when I teach my own classes, I like to have others define it for me because those who came before us have defined it much better than I can attempt to do. So I'll go to that great American commentator who was not even American himself, but the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville during his grand tour in the United States in the 1830s. He said most famously, "The situation of the Americans is therefore entirely exceptional, and it is to be believed that no other democratic people will be placed in it." Now, what did he mean? Well, he certainly did not mean that the United States was superior, better, on an upward trajectory to some destined future. If anything, what he meant is that what was happening in the United States and with this rise of American democracy, he was looking at Americans as kind of a weird group of people. And quite literally, an exceptional people, a different people. And what did he mean by that? People that were removed from and unbound from a feudal past, absolved from a noble ruling tradition, uncorrupted by an established state church. And what he found is instead a society that believed itself to be egalitarian, equalitarian is what he might say, people who defined their democratic republic based on what it was not: a monarchy, an aristocracy, an arbitrary ruling class. And if anything, what he noticed is that Americans believed themselves to be the first society in world history ever to predicate their nation on the ideal that the individual is sovereign and that the individual owes him and herself to natural rights that government is bound to protect.
So as a follow-up, how did these rival conceptions of these ideals develop in the course of the mid-19th century between the different sections of the country?
Yeah, I mean, this in my reading of the American past, it's the fundamental and ultimately irreconcilable definitions and conceptions of American exceptionalism that contribute to the coming of the American Civil War. And at the heart of this debate on what makes America unique in the 19th century, we have to locate the central place of slavery within an otherwise republic of liberty. It is by far the most consequential debate on the role of slavery in a constitutional republic, but a constitutional republic predicated in the Declaration of Independence on the ideals of natural human equality. And what we see at the very outset of the American political experience, at the Constitutional Convention itself, the convention meets in 1787 with something already having happened, over the previous decade in the newly found United States, and that is this presumption, as Sean Wilentz has described so well in his own work, this idea that governments do not or are not obligated to uphold property in man. This is itself a unique moment in human political traditions. Up to that point in human societies, it was just assumed that slavery and human bondage was a natural, normal part of life until the Revolutionary Era, when governments in the northern colonies, northern states begin to question this presumption. And so, as Wilentz describes, and I completely buy his argument, he says that perhaps it's not slavery that caused the American Civil War, but rather perhaps it is anti-slavery that caused the Civil War. Because we would never have the rise of a pro-slavery American exceptionalism, a pro-slavery ideology without its predecessor in anti-slavery.
And how did these differing Northern and Southern understandings of American ideals shape their reactions to the tumultuous events of the 1840s and 1850s?
It's a great question. By the 1840s and 50s, slaveholders in the United States had accrued a powerful and disproportionate share of political authority in the federal government. And anti-slavery advocates, both white and black, and ultimately the Republican Party by 1854, with the inception of the Republican Party, believed that slaveholders, should they proliferate human bondage across the nation, across the federal territories, across the continent, they would ultimately eradicate opportunity from common individual citizens from claiming private property, engaging in social mobility, economic independence, and personal sovereignty. Ultimately, Republicans alleged slaveholders and their allies in the Democratic Party for perpetuating a slave power conspiracy to overturn the entire democratic constitutional edifice of the American political order. Conversely, slaveholders alleged that anti-slavery advocates, in their abolitionist rhetoric and their anti-slavery rhetoric, ultimately would inspire the enslaved in the South to engage in massive, bloody rebellions and insurrections on the par of Jamaica and Haiti, Barbados, and overturn one of the last remaining powerful slaveholding nations in the world. And so, where does the compromise come in within this kind of condition? That's the question.
So, as a follow-up observation, perhaps, this debate over these rival views was rarely civil. There were debate, threats, even sort of widespread violence, even in the halls of Congress, maybe with the exception of the Compromise of 1850. But all of this contention that you're talking about leads to civil war.
This is one of the great ironies, really, because in the American exceptionalist tradition in the 19th century, on the one hand, Americans of all stripes believed their nation to be unique, separate, destined, even on a separate historical track from the rest of the world, which is what? Civil war, civil conflict, monarchical consolidation, centralizing power. And yet, in many respects, the United States is following along the same 19th century trajectory of civil conflict and civil disturbance that most other societies in the 19th century world experienced. And so Americans really did have to deal with this. There was always a complementary, abiding fear in the United States about disunion, about the prospect of civil war, what it would render, because in the advent of national collapse and civil war, the entire process of self-government would never be restored. The great fear among all parties is if this experiment in the United States fails, then every other opponent across the world of democracy, constitutional republicanism could point to the failure of the United States and say, see, it doesn't work. These upstart Americans tried something and it failed because, of course, it was destined to fail. Some people are born to rule and others are born to be ruled. And so this is in the back of the minds of most Americans percolating as the nation tries to negotiate the crisis over slavery.
And so, what are the rival views of Abraham Lincoln and the Confederates regarding secession?
Yeah, this is where it all points to. With Abraham Lincoln's election to the presidency in 1860, and by that, let's understand what that means. It's not just the election of Abraham Lincoln; it's the election of the first major anti-slavery party in American history to claim the White House and a majority in Congress. And at that point, they're pledged, explicitly pledged to placing slavery on the ultimate road to extinction. Now that could mean a century-long plan of gradual, compensated, very conservative processes of emancipation. But one thing was sure: the Republican Party pledged to place slavery in a confined space where it existed, pledged not to let it expand into the territories, not to expand into the Caribbean, hem it in, and ultimately choke it off. Well, if that's what they pledged, slaveholders in the American South believed them. And they said, all right, well, if this is the Republican plan, then our status as one of the world's lone remaining slaveholding societies is indelibly threatened. And if that's threatened, so is our constitutional equality under the American political order. And thus, what slaveholders turned to was the tradition of 1776, political self-determination, as they read the Declaration of Independence and pursued what they argued to be a peaceable secession. But equally true, in their words, they said, what we're going to do is we're going to create the world's first nation dedicated entirely, explicitly, to the proposition that all men are not created equal. As the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said, our new nation is built upon, its foundation is established, and its cornerstone rests upon the great truth. These are Stephens' words: the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. End quote. Nothing like this had ever happened on this level. Well, we have a crisis. If the United States is indeed a quote unquote exceptional nation predicated upon peaceable democracy, well, then secession is an illegitimate proposition. And that's the basis on which Lincoln contested the secession crisis. It's the idea that if political discontents lose a free, fair, and legitimate election, but then destroy the constitutional basis of the entire system, then democracy itself loses all legitimacy. And this would be only the first secession movement of its kind. What would happen in the northern states should a northern political minority lose an election? What would happen in the West if a Western political minority lost an election? The entire continent would erupt into these petty little fiefdoms of conflict that look much like the old world in Europe. And the American experiment, as they knew it and as we know it today, would be over. And so there are two explicit competing claims to exceptionalist purpose right at the outset in 1860 and 61.
And during the Civil War, how did emancipation and the enlistment in the Union Army of African American soldiers affect the understanding of American exceptionalism during the war?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important for us to recognize that emancipation is entirely a contingent outgrowth of how the Civil War evolved and ultimately concluded. Emancipation is not a foreordained end to the Civil War, just as United States victory is not a foreordained end. But as the war expands, as it becomes increasingly violent, as it becomes clear in the United States that the Confederacy is waging a very committed resistance to the United States, and if the Confederacy is predicating its existence on slavery, then it is only just, legally, morally just, to turn that institution against the rebellious states. But it also works insofar as emancipation ultimately cures the great cancer that has roiled the American political experiment for 80 plus years by removing the source of disunion, by removing the central source of sectional discord, by establishing, not at first, but ultimately establishing some type of consensus that slavery has no present and future in the United States. Only then can the United States, hopefully, in the minds of emancipation's practitioners, hopefully can the United States stave off future secession movements. Now, the enlistment of African American soldiers is a central feature in this. Ever since the beginning of the war, African American men petitioned the Lincoln government to enlist on behalf of the United States. Now think about this. This is powerful. We have in the 19th century few better exponents of the American project than African Americans, the very people who live at best as second-class citizens in the United States and at worst as enslaved subjects in the United States. And here they are in 1861 recognizing that their service in Union armies fulfills, gives purpose, gives definition, gives meaning to the very claim that the United States has always advertised itself, in Lincoln's words, as the last best hope. These men are not turning on the Republic. They view themselves as equal participants in the Republic that they at once want to preserve and ultimately perfect.
And how does Lincoln's expression of American democratic ideals in the Gettysburg Address, what does that tell us about American exceptionalism during the war?
There is no better explication of American exceptionalism prior to 1863 or since 1863 than the Gettysburg Address, though I suppose the Declaration of Independence would be a close contender. Without the Declaration, of course, Lincoln could never write the Gettysburg Address, and that's kind of his point. In 272 words and 2.5 minutes, Lincoln expressed the entire concept of American nationhood better than anybody. Lincoln is, in the Gettysburg Address, explaining what he always explained, and that is that the generations are bound to one another in American history and American life. As he said several months prior to Congress in December of 1862, we cannot escape history. And that was his message at Gettysburg, that the nation that was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal is now being tested. The nation from history is being tested in real time, and people, largely without their own consent, have found themselves in the middle of this testing. And it is those brave men who here gave their lives on the field at Gettysburg that have demonstrated the extent to which each generation must recommit and rededicate itself to this simple but abiding moral proposition that all people enjoy natural rights that are protected within a constitutional structure. And I think that he's reminding us that democracy is precarious, it is not inevitable, it is delicate, but it's also powerful. It encompasses all. It excludes nobody, at least in its perfected state. And as he said, I think this is connected way back to what he said 6 years previously in his retort to the Dred Scott decision. I feel like you can read Lincoln's response to Dred Scott and Gettysburg in tandem, and he's saying the same thing in such a powerful way. He's talking about how the American regime evolves and expands and grows over time if we allow its logic to expand and grow. And here's what he said. They, meaning the founders, meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a maxim for free society, which should be revered by all, familiar to all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for. And even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence. augmenting the happiness and value to all people of all colors everywhere. It's that idea that's being tested on the fields of battle by 1863. And Americans have a choice. We can either recognize what is objective, what is true, what once was, in Lincoln's words, a consensus, or we can reject it. Confederates had rejected it, explicitly, proudly so. They were attempting to build an alternative nation on the exact same soil that had once been conceived and dedicated for a particular purpose.
So, how did the North and South view the challenges of Reconstruction through this lens of American exceptionalism?
Yeah, Reconstruction, one of the most complex, complicated, and misunderstood aspects of all American history. Just because the United States wins the Civil War and just because emancipation is institutionalized in the 13th Amendment in 1865, in no way means that this conflict, this contest over American exceptionalism is over. If anything, it just escalated. You know, if we look at the Reconstruction South, what do we see by the end? It's not explicitly the reconstitution of the old slaveholding order, but it's something pretty close. Southern states have authored black codes which restrict, curtail, limit the freedom, the mobility, the opportunity of freed people. You have the President of the United States, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, overtly blessing the reestablishment, or I should say the maintenance of white political supremacy in the American South. And you have Republicans saying, all right, well, look, this war has to mean something, right? Union and emancipation have to mean something. And I'm simplifying a very complex set of issues here. But ultimately, what Republicans say is you cannot have freedom, i.e., emancipation, left undefined. Freedom has to be tied enduringly to liberty, right? The liberties protected and safeguarded in the Constitution. And so the 14th and 15th Amendments, much like emancipation itself, are unintended, unanticipated, contingent outgrowths of the Civil War, but their logic is rooted in something from the American past. The architects of the 14th Amendment said that what we are doing is embedding in the Constitution explicitly as we can, the principles of the Declaration of Independence. But here's the problem. Here's what ultimately happens. How do you enforce something so self-evident when there's so much white Southern resistance to something like the 14th and 15th Amendments? What you need is a strong, centralized, active government to enforce these provisions, to enforce these ends. And what ultimately transpires during the 1870s is an emergent critique, not from the Democrats, they're already critiquing this, but a critique among some Republicans, opponents to U.S. Grant, even within his own party, who are saying, if we have a strong, centralized, militant enforcement wing, then have we not transformed into the central states of Europe? And ultimately, what brings down Reconstruction is the Supreme Court, white violence in the South, and ambivalent Republicans who are all saying that the United States has gone too far, both in its racial reformation of the American South and its constitutional rehabilitation.
Now, American ideals have always been contested and debated. Andrew, how can history teach us maybe perhaps to find some common ground, moderation, through deliberation, civil conversation, building consensus? I know that the lessons of history are fraught, but can the failures that led to Civil War can they maybe teach us to do a little better?
Yeah, I mean it's the great question for our time, and I think what I want to do in first answering that question is to allow us in the 21st century a bit of grace and humility, and by that I mean let's recognize that we do live in a politically rancorous time. There is real political division, but let's also recognize that We are not at a time where we are more divided than ever before. History should teach us that. We should understand how and why our times today are at once similar, but also very different from those times in the past. Maybe not better, maybe not worse, but they're different. History requires humility, context, the ability to see things not in an A-B binary. But let's look at the gray areas. And let's recognize that at the end of the day, in order for the American constitutional experiment to work, you used a really important word that I think has been lost, both from our political culture and our lexicon, and that is consensus. I don't mean consensus on the real granular details. I mean consensus on really basic facts. What was the American founding? What is the purpose of American political institutions? What is not the purpose of American political institutions? What are the privileges but also limits bestowed upon electoral majorities? What are the protections but also the restraints imposed on electoral political minorities? These questions matter. And it seems to me that in many cases in our modern political life, these issues have been obscured. In order for this entire experiment to work, it's incumbent upon us. I mean, that's what Lincoln said at Gettysburg, right? It is rather for us, the living, to engage in the great unfinished work of those who passed on the fields at Gettysburg. I am in no way suggesting that war is the answer to our political solution or our political problems. It's not. But Lincoln was right that it's up to us. It is we who live in a political moment who have responsibility to deal with our problems in a civil manner, as long as there is a consensus that governs our political debate.
Andrew Lane, that's a wonderful note to end on. I hope we can achieve it. And I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you all for joining us on this special episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other videos on American ideals, on the American founding, and on the Civil War in our Scholar Talks library. Thank you.